Thank you. Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. John Lennon wrote those words in his lullaby, Beautiful Boy. I used to sing that song to my son Terry when he was a little boy, and we danced to it at his wedding in 2004. And today I'm here to talk to you about my beautiful boy, my son Terrence Swanston, who ended his life by suicide, and to speak about the stigma surrounding mental illness and suicide, the stigma that often stops those at risk from getting the help that they need, the stigma that undermines their memory if they complete suicide, and the stigma that rubs salt in the wounds of those of us left behind. When I Googled stigma definition, the first thing that came up was stigma, a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person, the stigma of mental disorder. Suicide knows no boundaries, and we cannot consider suicide prevention without addressing mental illness. We know that up to 90% of people who complete suicide have a diagnosable mental illness. So mental illness is sometimes a fatal disease, and the fatality is by suicide. I'm a Canadian, but my husband Michael was born in Bangor, and we lived here for the first few years of our marriage. We went back to Canada and lived in Montreal for many years, where our daughter Jennifer and our son Terrence were born. And I was a stay-at-home mom for 10 years, and I loved it. And Terry was a beautiful boy. Golden curls, big shining blue eyes, and the biggest smile. He was funny and bright, sweet and mischievous. He was also very sensitive. He had ADHD, and he struggled socially. When he was 13, we were transferred to Philadelphia. It was a big move at a very seminal age for him. He began acting out, experimenting with marijuana, and hanging out with the troubled kids. And by now we realized he was one of the troubled kids. And despite doing everything we could, he was pretty rebellious, and I think he was probably beginning to suffer some bouts of depression. In 1998, my husband and I decided to move back to Canada, to Vancouver, and Terry at 18 said he wasn't going to move. So with heavy hearts, we left him behind. And for a while, he kept us at arm's length, and we struggled to stay connected. Well, I did most of the struggling and pretty much all of the connecting. And then in 2001, he met a young woman who eventually became his wife, and we breathed a sigh of relief. They seemed happy together, and things seemed to be going well. Michael and I now live in Campbell River on Vancouver Island, and on the west coast of Canada. And in 2010, we plan to meet Terry and his wife here in Northern Ireland to visit the family. August 21st, 2010 was a beautiful day in Campbell River. I tried calling Terry in the morning, but I didn't get any answer. My friend and I went out. We were having a lovely morning. And around noon, her husband called and asked, would we please stop at her house on our way before going out for lunch. And as we pulled into the driveway, I was surprised to see my husband's car there. And I walked into their living room, and he was standing with the most stricken look I have ever seen on his face. And he spoke the words that shattered my life. Terrence committed suicide. The air was sucked out of my lungs, and I felt like I was in a surreal horror movie. I remember thinking, he's in hospital, but he's going to be okay. And then I realized he would never be okay again. No! No! No, God, no, this can't be happening. Please, no. My son, my boy, oh God, no. I felt like I was falling down a hole with no bottom. And yet it was all too true. He was gone. Later we learned that at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, our son, our beautiful boy, ended his life with a gunshot to his head, just 1 week short of his 30th birthday. He must have been preparing to do that when I had tried to call him earlier and he didn't answer the phone. What if he had answered? What if? When he took his life, Terry shattered our plans. He shattered my heart. my sense of security, and my life changed forever. It was and still is unfathomable, and I have struggled to come to terms with his irrevocable act. The day after he died, I spoke with a friend who told me that she had attempted suicide several years earlier in the grip of a terrible depression. She described what she called a suicidal coma, a place where there was only pain, where the darkness was so complete that she could not remember the love she felt for others, nor feel the love they had for her. And it seemed clear to her in this suicidal coma that the only way to stop her pain was to die. Fortunately, she survived. And she eventually realized that she didn't want to die, that she just wanted to stop the pain. She told me I will never understand why, that she does not really understand why she did it. She said a suicidal coma comes from an irrational state of mind that you cannot understand from a rational state of mind. This was my first step in beginning to come to terms with my son's death. We eventually learned that Terry took his life while suffering a profound depression. His wife and closest friends had tried desperately to convince him to get help, and he rebuffed all their attempts. He left a 3-part note addressed to his wife, his family, and one of those friends, who's a social worker. And to her he wrote, "You could not help me because I would not let you. I am so sorry." Why? Why, with so much love and support, why did he refuse their help? I believe he felt ashamed, worthless, and hopeless. That admitting he was sick and needed help was too shameful. That he did not feel worthy of being helped, and that he felt there really was no hope. Have you ever not gone to a doctor when you were sick, when you had a cold or a cough or a sinus infection? Sure, most of us have not gone to the doctor even though we were sick. Have you ever not told someone something because you were afraid of what they might say or think? Yeah, we've all done that. Had a little secret, don't want to tell anybody because they might not think good things about us. So it isn't surprising that people who are depressed or anxious or thinking about killing themselves don't always ask for help or go to the doctor or call a hotline. They're afraid of what people might think. Oh, you must be nuts. One of those. Just get over it. Do you remember when we called cancer the big C? When unwed pregnancies, domestic violence, and homosexuality were totally taboo subjects? Well, mental illness and suicide are still taboo. People don't want to hear about them or speak about them. I know. I experienced that deafening silence after my son died. Hardly anyone would speak to me about him, say his name, talk about his life, or how he died. I felt so isolated and alone, and I knew that we need to make the unspeakable speakable. What are the first words you think of when I say mental health? Just throw out some words. So, depression, yeah, what else? Sad. Nuts, schizo, therapy, people who push carts around and live under bridges. That's what we think of. That's what our culture has taught us. What are the first words you think about when I say mental illness? Pretty much the same words. It's because we don't differentiate between mental health and mental illness. Mental health is how we think, feel, act, make decisions, relate to people. It's how we do life. It has nothing to do with mental illness. If you have a brain, you have mental health. It is our emotional, cognitive, and psychological well-being. Mental illness is a medical condition that disrupts a person's ability to think, feel, act, relate. It affects our brain. What do you think about when I say physical health? Broken leg. Physical health. What do you think about when I say physical health? Most people think of fitness, diet, exercise, being in good shape. When we think about physical health, we think about positive things. When we think about mental health, we think about negative things. When we think about mental health or mental illness, we feel uncomfortable. We shy away, we joke. It's something that happens to them. It doesn't happen to me. I'm okay. That's stigma. Do you remember that Google definition? Stigma, a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. The stigma of mental disorder. That really just struck me right between the eyes when I read that last example. In any given year, 1 in 5 people will have an issue with their mental health, will have a mental illness. 1 in 5 people. That's 1 in 5 people in this room. Anybody looking around, starting to count off? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Feel a little uncomfortable? Yeah. Maybe, notice people giggle a little bit. But if I were to say to you that unfortunately in our lifetime, 1 in 5 people in this room will die of breast cancer or lung cancer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nobody is laughing now. Why is that? Cancer isn't funny. No one jokes about cancer, but we joke about mental illness. That's stigma. Mental illness isn't funny. People who might need help don't go for help because they're afraid of what people might think. They're afraid of the stigma and shame. My son was offered help, and he didn't go. Even some mental health professionals are not immune. Fergus, in a paper I read of his, wrote, "We also receive frequent client feedback on the experience of condescending, judgmental, less than empathetic attitudes from mental health treatment providers." So if trained professionals are affected by the stigma, what can we expect from the public? Many people do not seek help, do not tell those even closest to them about their pain or ideas of suicide because they feel ashamed, worthless, and hopeless. And who is at risk for mental illness? Everyone. 1 in 5 people in this room will be affected this year. It could even be you. When my son died, I sustained what I call a traumatic emotional brain injury. I was lost in a grief pit of despair and depression, and there were times I wished I could join him. The fact is that after a suicide of a loved one, survivors' risk for suicide goes up. In your package, you have a copy of an open letter that I sent out to quite a few people a while ago. Fergus referred to it earlier. What I was surprised and gratified in a way was after I sent it out, how many people got back to me and thanked me for sharing my story, and particularly for offering some simple things they could do if faced with someone in pain or grief, or someone who might be considering suicide. I suggested they take time to listen to them, to speak to them about it, that speaking about suicide does not cause someone to become suicidal or increase the risk, that showing genuine concern by asking directly about suicide can be part of an immediate intervention. And I actually, just in the last week, had an opportunity to do that with a very good friend of mine. At the end of a conversation, I hung up the phone, and I thought, darn, I've got to phone her back. And I phoned her back, and I said, this is really hard, but are you considering suicide? And she was silent, and she said yes, she had been thinking about it. And we had quite a conversation, and she agreed that she would talk to somebody about it. She had been seeing a counselor. And we've had more conversations, and I think, people also told me their own stories of mental illness and suicidal thoughts, and their reluctance to talk because of the shame and stigma that they had felt. And I realized that my letter had begun to change some people's attitudes, to open their minds so they could open their hearts. This conference is called Suicide Prevention: What Works. In order for the initiatives you are speaking about here today to work effectively, I believe a fundamental shift in the perception of what mental health, mental illness, and suicide must occur. It will never be okay until people understand that we all have mental health and that anyone can fall victim to mental illness. We need to speak about the reality and impact of mental illness, that it is sometimes fatal, and that fatality is by suicide. We need to let people know that the stigma and silence surrounding mental illness and suicide contributes to those deaths. We must not let silence prevail in the wake of tragedy. We must speak out and replace the stigma with compassion and understanding. We need to open people's minds so they can open their hearts and make the unspeakable speakable. It is my deepest hope that I can help to eliminate the stigma around mental illness so that no one will feel so ashamed, worthless, or hopeless that they complete suicide rather than seeking help, and that no one will ever know the excruciating pain and suffering of losing a loved one to suicide again. Then my beautiful boy, my Terry, will not have died in vain. Thank you. Namaste.